At 5:41 p.m. on June 17, 1864, in a shallow trench line east of Petersburg, Virginia, Corporal Nathaniel Briggs lay on his belly behind a sandbagged parapet, watching a gray skirmish line form in the pine smoke 180 yards out. A long rifle sat braced in the mud. Perched on top wasn't a factory scope or a quartermaster-issued sight. A blackened brass tube, salvaged lenses, wire wrap, pitch-sealed seams, rode low over the barrel like it had been bolted there by a man who didn't ask permission. 6 weeks earlier, that tube had been a joke. Back at camp, officers laughed at it the way bored men laugh at anything unfamiliar. One lieutenant called it Briggs' sewer pipe. Another asked if he planned to spy on Richmond from the trench. Even the armorer refused to touch it because the Army didn't issue glass to enlisted men, and the Army loved paperwork more than innovation. Now those same men weren't laughing. They were crouched behind him, listening to the crack of Confederate rifles and the soft, sick thud of bullets biting into sandbag. Out in front, the ground wasn't open the way textbooks draw it. It was churned into ridges by shells and hooves, cut with shallow dips that could hide a crawling man, stitched with tree stumps that turned into instant cover the moment someone got desperate. That's why the Union left here mattered. This flank wasn't a wall. It was a seam. Thin trenches, tired regiments, too few reserves. If Lee's men punched through this side and rolled it, the line didn't just bend, it peeled. Supply routes behind the works would open like a door, and the whole position would become a retreat under fire. Smoke made the problem worse. Pine smoke from burning brush drifted low across the field, hanging in layers that turned men into half-shapes and motion into rumor. Iron sights lied in that kind of haze. Eyes lied, too. The brass tube didn't lie as easily. Through it, Briggs wasn't searching for whole bodies. He was watching the gaps, dark slits between trunks where a man could settle, disappear, and still kill you. The trick was to catch the moment the gap became occupied. The instant shadow turned into structure. A Confederate rifle cracked first. Sand jumped from the parapet 2 bays down, and a Union private jerked back with his cheek sliced open by grit and cloth. That shot wasn't aimed to kill. It was a feeler. A man testing distance and reaction, checking who flinches, checking who stands. Another crack followed, sharper, closer. This time a corporal near the traverse folded without a sound, sliding down the trench wall like he'd simply run out of strength. Breath left him in one clean exhale, and the men around him froze because they understood the new rule. Someone out there was taking time. A lieutenant behind Briggs whispered, "Can you see them?" No answer came back right away. Briggs stayed flat, cheek pressed into the stock, keeping the tube steady while the field shifted in and out of smoke. A first-time shooter looks for certainty. A practiced one waits for a mistake. A mistake arrived. Near a forked pine, a thin line of movement flickered. Just a shoulder settling, a sleeve edge tugged into position, the faint metallic wink of a barrel that caught the wrong angle of light for half a heartbeat. Briggs didn't rush the shot. Letting a man finish his settle makes the bullet's job easier, because a settled shooter holds still long enough to be punished. The trigger broke. Recoil shoved into his shoulder, and the tube bounced once before he brought it back down. Across the field, bark spat from the forked pine. Then a shape collapsed behind it, disappearing into the dirt. No dramatic flailing followed. A hat brim slid sideways and stayed there. Silence landed heavier than the report. A skirmish line can absorb a loss, but it can't hide hesitation. Men who had been inching forward stopped inching. Rifles that had been rising stalled halfway. An order drifted from deeper in the trees, and it didn't carry cleanly through smoke. The lieutenant exhaled like he'd been holding air in his chest as a private dare. "You hit him," he said, more statement than praise. Briggs worked the bolt and kept the same pocket framed. A second figure crawled toward the fallen man, trying to hook a collar and drag him back. That rescue wasn't bravery. It was reflex, and reflex makes bodies do predictable things. Another shot cracked. The crawling stopped. 2 gray figures now lay tangled at the base of that forked pine, and the Confederate line subtly shifted away from that patch of ground as if it had turned poisonous. The trench behind Briggs changed in a way nobody announced out loud. Men stopped firing blind volleys into smoke. Officers stopped calling for a little more powder, like noise could solve a precision problem. A sergeant leaned in and asked a question that would have sounded insane a month earlier. "Where do you want us?" That's the moment the tube stopped being a joke and started being an instrument. Confederate fire answered with a different kind of intent. Shots began snapping into sandbags at the exact height where Briggs's scope would have to appear. Someone out there had stopped hunting the trench in general and started hunting one specific thing: the glass. A neat hole punched through the sandbag seam Briggs had used 30 seconds earlier. No blood followed it. A second shot cut into the same seam, slightly higher, like a man correcting his aim. That wasn't skirmish fire anymore. That was a sharpshooter trying to break the only advantage the Union left had in this sector, the ability to see first. Briggs slid 2 bays down without lifting his head, dragging the rifle like a long plank through mud, then settled behind a different parapet angle and held. The lieutenant tracked him, eyes wide now, voice smaller. "How many can you do?" he asked, half in awe, half in fear of the answer. Briggs didn't look back, because the number wasn't the point yet. Holding the seam was. By nightfall, 11 Confederates would be down in front of this left flank. Some shot as they formed, some cut out of cover, some dropped while trying to drag friends to safety. That tally would get repeated later like a campfire legend. Right now, it was only the first 2, and an enemy who had just realized the real target wasn't Briggs. It was the homemade scope that let him kill men who thought smoke made them invisible. So how did a corporal end up in a Federal trench with a piece of homemade glass that the Army didn't issue, the officers mocked, and the enemy decided to hunt first? That answer starts months earlier, before Petersburg, before the trenches, back when Briggs was still a machinist's son who knew one thing most soldiers never learn. If you can't outshoot the problem, you outthink it. March 1864. Camp near Brandy Station, Virginia. Mud everywhere. Damp wood smoke in the trees. Men cleaning rifled muskets the same way they've cleaned them since Bull Run. Ramrod out, patch in, powder fouling scraped like it's a ritual that keeps death away. Nathaniel Briggs didn't clean the way the others did. A machinist's son from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, he treated his Springfield like a tool you could improve, not a relic you had to respect. Fine with his hands, worse with authority. The kind of corporal who could fix a broken lock plate with a file and a nail, then get written up for speaking out of turn. 24 years old, no confirmed marksman designation, no bird and patch on his sleeve, nothing official that said sharpshooter. One thing did mark him out. Every time a man got hit in the trenches, Briggs watched the space the shot came from instead of the man who fell. A gap between rails, a seam in brush, a dark notch under a stump. That habit came from before the war. On his father's bench sat a lathe, a vise, and a tray of odd parts nobody threw away because someday might arrive. Brass offcuts, broken lenses from magnifiers, a cracked survey glass with one element still clear. Briggs grew up learning that scraps weren't trash if you knew what they could become. So when the regiment wintered and boredom mixed with fear, he started hunting for glass. Not government glass. Forget that. Crossed the quartermaster off, too. What he needed was anything with a clean lens and a tube that could survive recoil. A sutler's wagon gave him the first piece, a busted theater glass, one side shattered, the other still sharp enough to make a man's face jump closer. A surgeon's discarded magnifier supplied another lens, warped at the edge but usable in the center. Then, a cavalryman traded him a cracked field glass body for tobacco and a promise, make it into something that sees. Briggs took all of it back to his shelter and began doing what armies hate. He experimented. 2 lenses in a tube will magnify, but they'll also lie if you don't align them. Poor centering gives you double images. Bad spacing turns the world into a blur. Light leaks ruin contrast so badly you'd be better off with naked eyes. A week went into trial and error. Another week went into building a body that could hold alignment under shock. Brass tube, blackened over a candle to kill shine. Pitch and beeswax worked into seams to keep moisture out. Wire wrap twisted tight enough to bite the metal. A crude mount filed from scrap iron, shaped into a saddle so the tube sat low enough that he could keep his cheek down on the stock instead of lifting his head like a target on a post. That low mount mattered. Raise your head and you show more face. Show more face and a Confederate rifleman gets a clean angle. With the tube low, the scope didn't turn him into a periscope. It turned him into a man who could see without standing up to be seen. On a calm afternoon, he carried it to the edge of camp and tested it the only way a soldier can test anything, with risk. A white stump at 200 yards became his target. Through iron sights, it was a pale smudge. Through the tube, it gained texture, bark lines, chips, shadows. He fired. The mini-ball slapped dirt low. He adjusted by instinct, not with knobs, because there were no knobs, shimming the rear of the mount with a sliver of wood and tightening the wire wrap until the tube stopped shifting. The second shot chewed the stump. A third tore it again, close enough that he could see the fresh wood brighten like bone. That should have been the moment the idea became real to his officers. Instead, it became entertainment. A lieutenant wandered over and squinted at the rifle like it had grown an extra limb. Someone else leaned in, saw the black tube, and laughed with the casual cruelty of men who don't want the world to change. "Sewer pipe," one voice said. Spyglass for a corporal, another added. Then the name that stuck, homemade scope, spoken like a diagnosis. The armorer made it worse. He took one look at the wire-wrapped mount and asked whose property it was. Briggs said the rifle was issued, the glass was his, and the mount was temporary. The armorer didn't care about temporary. He cared about liability. No stamp, no entry, he said. That thing breaks. You blame the army. That thing glints. You get somebody killed. You blame the army. Take it off. Briggs didn't take it off. He just stopped showing it. The scope became a private piece of contraband tucked under a blanket when inspections came through, then bolted back on when the regiment marched. That dance taught him something useful. If authority won't authorize your advantage, you build it anyway and keep it quiet until the day it's needed. Spring bled into early summer. Orders came down. Petersburg, trenches, a new kind of war where men died without ever seeing who killed them. That's when the sewer pipe stopped being a hobby and became a plan. Because trench war punishes the same weakness over and over. You can't shoot what you can't find, and you can't find what you can't see. Smoke hides everything. Brush hides everything. Fear makes eyes narrow. Glass doesn't fix fear. It does fix distance. It turns a suggestion of movement into a shoulder. It turns a dark gap into a face. Briggs knew the risk too. Glass can flash. A sun hit at the wrong angle becomes a signal flare. Moisture can fog a lens, turning your advantage into a useless tube at the worst possible moment. Recoil can walk the mount loose by inches, and inches at 200 yards means a miss that gives your position away. So he built habits around those problems. Cloth hood over the objective end when light got harsh. A smear of soot to dull any shine that survived blackening. Breath held low, face close to the stock, never hovering above the parapet. After every shot, a hand went to the mount, not to adjust, but to confirm it hadn't shifted. All of that was preparation for one thing, not a duel at 1,000 yards, not a heroic stand in open field, a trench line under pressure where the Union left could buckle if the wrong men stayed invisible for too long. By the time the regiment reached the works outside Petersburg, the officers had stopped mocking openly. Discomfort replaced humor. Nobody likes admitting an enlisted man might be right about something they don't understand. Pride makes people pretend a new idea is harmless until the first casualties make harmlessness look expensive. June 17th was coming. The smoke was already in the trees. And somewhere out in those pines, Confederate riflemen were settling into the kind of shallow cover that makes an iron sight shooter guess. Briggs wasn't planning to guess anymore. June 16th, 1864. Evening. Outside Petersburg, the air smells like damp clay and burned powder, the kind of smell that settles into uniforms and never leaves. Union engineers have been cutting trenches into the ground, like they're carving a second world beneath the first. Sandbags go up, headlogs roll into place, traverses get thrown across the line so one shell can't rake a whole company from end to end. Out in front, the land looks calm. That calm is a lie. Pine smoke hangs low over the open, turning every tree line into a smudged silhouette. Skirmishers move the way they always do, low, quick, careful, except here the distance between life and death is measured in a man's willingness to show his head. Late that night, a runner comes down the trench with a message that isn't dressed up as drama. Left sector is thin. Confederate skirmishers are feeling for it. Any break there opens the line like a seam. Briggs hears all of it while sitting in a dugout half full of mud, the sewer pipe, wrapped in cloth like contraband. Around him, men talk about their rifles the way people talk about weather, complaining because it's all they can do. The issued Springfield is accurate enough. Iron sights are honest. None of that matters when the person shooting you is hidden behind brush and smoke. June 17th, 1864, 5:41 p.m. A shallow trench line east of Petersburg, Virginia. Corporal Nathaniel Briggs is flat on his belly behind a sandbagged parapet, looking into a gray skirmish line forming 180 yards out. The Confederates aren't charging in a clean wave. They're building a problem one body at a time, men sliding into stumps, kneeling behind fallen logs, crawling into the kind of cover that makes return fire useless. A crack snaps over the trench. A private 2 bays down jerks backward, and his cap flips off like it's been slapped. Blood runs into the dirt, dark instantly. Somebody drags him down behind the traverse. Somebody else swears and tries to peek over the top. The second shot punishes that peek. A ball clips the sandbag and throws a puff of dust into the man's eyes, close enough to make him flinch away before the third round can find skin. Now, nobody wants to look. The officers want fire. The men want cover. Between those two needs, the left sector starts shrinking. Briggs doesn't ask permission. A hand slips under his blanket. The tube comes out. Wire-wrapped mount bites into the rifle's wood. One last check with his thumb confirms the thing hasn't shifted in the crawl. A lieutenant notices the movement and starts to speak, ready to mock, ready to forbid, ready to put the rulebook between himself and risk. Then another man gets hit. The sound changes in a trench when fear becomes math. Less shouting, more breathing, more waiting for the next crack. The lieutenant swallows whatever he was going to say and leans down instead. "Can you see them?" he asks, like the question hurts. Through iron sights, Briggs sees a dark band where the pines begin. Through the scope, the band breaks into seams. A low stump, a notch beneath it, a sliver of sleeve that doesn't match bark. A face turned sideways, pale against soot. Briggs settles the front sight where the sleeve meets the body. The Springfield kicks. A man in gray collapses as if a string got cut. No cheer comes from the trench. Nobody wants to reveal anything by reacting. The lieutenant just stares, then looks down the line like he's trying to decide whether this is luck. Another crack answers him from the trees. A ball smacks into the parapet, showering grit. Someone hisses, "Down!" like it's a prayer. Briggs stays down. His scope shifts slightly left, hunting for the origin the way he hunted stumps and brush at camp. Only now, the penalty for guessing wrong is a bullet in the face. A flicker in the smoke gives it away. Too quick to be a leaf, too straight to be wind. The Confederate shooter is relocating. That detail matters more than the last kill, because it explains why the Union line is bleeding. They aren't being shot by one man standing still. They're being worked by a screen. Briggs tracks the movement like he's watching a machine. There, behind a fallen pine, just enough space for a barrel and an eye. The second shot goes out. A gray figure jerks, rolls, and doesn't get back up. The lieutenant finally commits. A crouch brings his mouth close to Briggs's ear. "Take them as you see them," he says. "I'll keep men off the parapet." That's not praise. It's a procedural change. One officer in one trench quietly rewires the rules. The corporal with the illegal glass gets to hunt, and the rest of the line gets told to stop giving the enemy easy silhouettes. A sergeant slides into position on Briggs's left without being asked. Not a spotter with training, just a steady man whose job becomes watching Briggs, watching the mount, watching for shine, watching for anything that might betray them. Smoke thickens as the minutes pass. Somewhere to the right, a battery fires, and the concussion pushes air through the trenches like a shove. The Confederate skirmish line answers with scattered shots, probing, measuring. Briggs keeps doing one thing. He finds the gaps. A canteen flash in the brush, then a man's shoulder. A cap brim that's too clean to be stump. A hand moving dirt to build a little shelf for a rifle. Each time the scope makes the hidden thing obvious, the Springfield speaks. By 6:30 p.m., the left sector feels different. Less random death, more hesitation in the trees. That hesitation is its own kind of victory because skirmishers don't like being hunted. They like being unseen. They like shooting men who can't locate them. The scope takes that comfort away. A Confederate officer tries to fix it. He steps out just enough to wave men forward, using his sword arm like a pointer in a classroom. The gesture is fast, confident, practiced, the kind of movement that assumes the other side can't see you clearly through smoke. The scope makes him look close. Briggs doesn't aim at the blade. He aims at the chest behind it. The officer goes down hard, and the skirmish line behind him stalls like it hit a wall. Now the lieutenant's tone changes. Not excitement, recognition. "What's your count?" he asks, like he needs a number to justify what he's allowing. Briggs answers without looking away from the glass. 6, he says. Then he adds something that sounds small, but isn't. 2 moved after the hit. A corporal noticing movement after impact means the shots aren't just noise. They're deliberate. Light starts to fade. The tree line becomes a darker smear again. The scope still helps, but it can't make dusk into noon. A good shooter learns when to stop before the enemy learns where you are. So Briggs does the safer thing. He shifts his attention to places a man must show himself to shoot. Loopholes cut into brush, tiny windows in stump cover, the mouth of a shallow pit that keeps reappearing with a barrel. One more crack. Another man drops, then another. 9. The lieutenant leans closer again, voice low and sharp. "They're pulling back," he says, like he doesn't trust his own eyes. A few minutes later, the firing slackens. Confederate skirmishers melt into the pines, leaving the open ground empty except for bodies and the occasional twitch of someone not dead yet. The left sector holds through that hour because the pressure shifts. Instead of the Union line being blind, the Confederate line becomes uncertain. Instead of Union men dying for looking, Confederate riflemen start dying for hiding. Briggs doesn't celebrate it. A wire-wrapped scope isn't a trophy when you can hear wounded men behind you trying not to scream. Night comes. The trench goes quiet in the way trenches get quiet. Soft voices, careful steps, no unnecessary silhouettes. Somewhere down the line, a captain gets informed that the corporal with the glass just changed the rhythm of the fight. Orders don't arrive in writing. No formal commendation appears. Only a quiet instruction passed mouth to mouth. Keep Briggs in the left sector tomorrow and bring him whatever he needs. Because June 17th wasn't over. It was only the first time the Confederates realized the thing they'd been using, invisibility, could be taken from them. June 18th, 1864, before sunrise, east of Petersburg. Night withdraws slow in Virginia. Darkness doesn't lift so much as thin, turning the world from black into a dirty blue. In the trench, men wake up the same way they fell asleep. Boots on, canteens half empty, faces crusted with powder dust. Briggs is already awake. A scope teaches you an ugly habit. You start believing you can see everything if you just stare long enough. That's why he's lying behind the parapet again, cheek pressed to stock, the brass tube wrapped in cloth until the very last second. A sergeant crawls up beside him with a tin cup of coffee and a message from the captain. Keep him on the left. No one says officially. Nobody writes it down. The captain just sends two things that matter: a runner to keep traffic away from Briggs's sector and a shovel detail to build him a cleaner loophole. They don't cut a big window. A big window gets you killed. Instead, the men carve a slit in the headlog, barely wider than the barrel, with a second slit 2 feet to the right that's empty. A decoy port, a false mouth, something for an enemy marksman to punish while Briggs stays alive. Behind that, they stack fresh sandbags and sprinkle damp clay over the top. Dry sand throws dust when it's hit. Dust tells the enemy exactly where to shoot next. As the light grows, the Confederate skirmish line returns, but it doesn't return the same. Yesterday they crawled into cover and took their time. This morning they behave like men who learned a lesson. No loitering, no waving arms, no long pauses in one spot. A gray figure darts into the pines, then another. Shots come in singles from different points, never repeating long enough to give a pattern. Somebody out there is hunting the tube. Briggs notices the change the way a machinist notices a new vibration in a familiar engine. The tempo is wrong. The spacing is deliberate. Whoever is directing this isn't just trying to kill Union pickets. They're trying to force Briggs to show himself. A ball smacks the headlog near the empty slit. Another hits the sandbags above the reel port a second later, high and testing, like someone is walking their aim across a board. The sergeant beside Briggs mutters, "They've got a good hand." Briggs doesn't answer. He slides the cloth off the tube and keeps his face low enough that the glass never catches sky. Soot from last night's cook fire is smeared along the scope body, turning brass into dull charcoal. Even the mount looks ugly on purpose. Pretty things shine. Shine gets men killed. At 5:12 a.m., a Confederate rifle cracks from the tree line and a Union private yelps as a ball tears through his sleeve. Not fatal, but loud enough to draw heads up the trench. That's the trap. A good skirmish screen isn't only about hits. It's about controlling behavior. The lieutenant from yesterday shows up behind the traverse and barks orders that sound petty until you realize their survival. No heads above the parapet, no answering shots unless you have a target. Anybody who needs to look uses the periscope board, 2 scraps of mirror nailed to a plank at angles, so the enemy sees glass instead of eyes. Then he kneels beside Briggs, lower than pride would normally allow, and speaks like a man trying to keep his voice from shaking. "They're walking their fire on your hole," he says. "We can't lose you." Briggs shifts the rifle to the empty slit, not to shoot, to watch. A Confederate marksman is waiting for the scope man to use the same opening twice. That's why the empty port exists, so the enemy wastes his best shots on air. A ball snaps into the decoy slit right on cue, punching splinters off the headlog. The lieutenant's eyes widen. Christ! Briggs finally moves to the reel port, slow, controlled, while the enemy thinks he already found him. Through the tube, the tree line stops being a smear again. A knot of brush resolves into geometry. A rifle barrel doesn't grow out of a shrub. A human hand doesn't belong on bark. At 5:27 a.m., Briggs takes his first shot of the day. The target isn't a face. It's a shoulder tucked behind a stump, the same stump that has been spitting careful bullets into the trench. The Springfield kicks. In the scope's wobble, Briggs sees the shoulder collapse and the barrel dip into the dirt. No follow-up shot comes from that stump. A minute passes, then 2. The firing shifts elsewhere, farther right, as if the Confederates are trying to convince themselves the stump was never their best shooter. That's 1. Not in a ledger, not on paper. Just 1 enemy rifle quieted long enough for the left sector to breathe. By 6 a.m., the sun is up and the smoke is worse, because batteries have started their day. Artillery from both sides trades slow, heavy blows. The ground shakes in small pulses, making even the scope image tremble. Shells aren't aimed at Briggs. They don't need to be. A shell aimed at the trench collapses cover, throws men into panic, forces movement, forces silhouettes. Silhouettes invite rifles. At 6:18 a.m., a Confederate shell lands short and sprays dirt into the parapet, peppering the sandbags with pebbles. Men curse and duck. Somebody pops up without thinking, and a rifle shot snaps over the headlog like a whip. Briggs doesn't chase the sound. He waits for the second shot. Smart shooters fire twice from the same place when they're confident. Hungry shooters relocate after one. The second crack comes from a thin line of pines at the edge of the smoke, and the scope finds the seam where a man is crouched behind a trunk with his cheek welded to wood. Briggs's front sight settles. The trigger breaks. The crouched figure falls sideways, shoulders sliding down bark until he slumps into the roots. 2. The lieutenant doesn't speak now. He just signals down the trench, 2 fingers, then points forward like he's counting time, not bodies. At 7:05 a.m., the Confederates try a different method. A gray skirmisher runs a ragged line straight across an open patch, not aiming to hit anything, just trying to draw shots. A decoy, a runner, a cheap sacrifice meant to make Briggs fire so they can follow the muzzle blast. Briggs doesn't take it. A running man at that range is a temptation, and temptation is how you give away a position. The runner makes it across, and for a moment the Confederate tree line goes still, as if they're annoyed the bait didn't work. Silence can be a weapon too. It makes you doubt. It makes your neck itch. It makes you want to look. That's when the third enemy shooter reveals himself, barely, foolishly, by adjusting his hat brim. The movement is tiny, but the scope was built for tiny. Briggs fires, and the hat tumbles off as the man collapses backward into brush. 3. From there, the morning turns into a grim routine. A barrel appears. Briggs takes it away. A sleeve shifts behind a stump. He makes it stop shifting. A man crawls to a new hole. The scope finds the hole's mouth and punishes it. By 9:30 a.m., the left sector isn't just holding. It's forcing the Confederate skirmishers to widen their spacing. That makes their fire less coordinated. It makes their pressure thinner. It gives Union officers the one thing trenches are built to buy: time. Then, the Confederates finally commit to the thing Briggs has been expecting since first light. They try to kill him directly. At 10:12 a.m., a single shot hits the headlog a handspan above the real loophole and punches a clean divot out of wood, too precise for random skirmish fire. A proper marksman, probably with a better piece than the average enlisted man. Briggs feels the impact through the parapet and knows what it means. Someone has decided the scope isn't a nuisance, it's a target. The lieutenant's hand clamps onto Briggs's boot. "Don't shoot," he whispers. "Move." Briggs doesn't argue. He backs out like a man sliding out of a coffin, keeping the tube wrapped in his head low. The sergeant replaces him with a hat on a bayonet, raising it slowly above the parapet at the decoy slit. The enemy's shot comes instantly. Wood splinters again. The hat flips off the bayonet like it's been slapped by a giant hand. Every man in the trench understands the same fact at the same time. If that had been a forehead, the day would already be over. Briggs shifts 20 yards down the line to a secondary port they prepared after dawn. Another small slit, another decoy mouth, another angle on the same tree line. The Confederate marksman is still watching the first hole, waiting for the scope man to be brave or stupid. Briggs chooses neither. From the new angle, the scope finds the marksman's tell, the piece of cloth tied to his barrel to break outline, moving in a way wind can't explain. At 10:29 a.m., Briggs fires once. The cloth drops. So does the barrel. 4. The left sector exhales as if someone finally loosened a belt. No celebration comes, only work. Because if the enemy brought one good marksman, they can bring another. Noon arrives with heat and smoke tangled together. Men drink warm water and chew hardtack like punishment. A runner brings a note from the captain. 2 lines, delivered like orders but written like gratitude. Hold that sector. Quartermaster will send more cartridges. By 2 p.m., Confederate skirmish fire returns in bursts and the pace accelerates. The pressure feels like someone turning a crank faster. Union officers are shifting companies for a larger attack elsewhere, and the left cannot give ground while the rest of the line rearranges. That's when Briggs racks up what the title will later turn into a clean number. Not heroics, throughput. He works targets the way he worked seams in smoke yesterday. Quick identification, one shot, then stillness. Each hit makes the next man hesitate. Each hesitation buys another minute for the trench line to stay intact. By late afternoon, the official tally starts forming, because men can now see bodies in the open where the smoke thins. Some lie near stumps, others are face down at the edge of a shallow depression, too far for Confederates to retrieve without exposing themselves. A lieutenant with a notebook crawls up and asks for times, not poems, times. Briggs gives them 5:27, 6:31, 10:29. He doesn't list names, he lists moments because moments are what get remembered. At 5:40 p.m., almost exactly 24 hours after the first fight began, Briggs takes the shot that makes the day's count land, where it will be repeated later. A Confederate sergeant tries to rally men forward, crouched and furious, motioning with his hand like he can shove courage into them. The scope makes his face readable for a second. Briggs fires. The man collapses forward and doesn't rise again. 11 for the day. Not because Briggs wanted a number, because the left sector needed a wall, and the only wall available was a man who could see through smoke. When darkness starts to creep back in, the captain finally comes himself, stepping into the trench like he owns the mud. He looks at the battered headlog, the decoy slit chewed to splinters, and the little brass tube that none of his paperwork authorizes. Then he looks at Briggs. "You keep that thing covered," he says. "You keep it dull. You keep it off the skyline." A pause follows, heavy with what he isn't saying. "And you keep doing exactly what you did today." June 18th, 1864. Dusk, east of Petersburg. When the light goes, the trench stops being a firing position and becomes a listening post. Rifles quiet down, canteens come out, men chew whatever they can find. Somewhere behind the line, a battery still throws a shell every few minutes like it's trying to keep the night nervous. On the left, the captain doesn't let anyone relax. A sentry gets posted specifically for one job: watch the skyline for shapes. Another sentry gets posted for a different job: watch the trench itself for movement. Because there's a rumor moving through the company now, and it isn't about bravery. Word is the Confederates have a marksman detail assigned to the glass man. That detail doesn't need daylight to work. All they need is a predictable habit, a familiar loophole, a head that rises the same way at the same time. So the captain changes the habits. No one uses the same slit twice in a row. Loopholes get rotated, decoy ports get rebuilt, even the rhythm of the watch changes, shorter shifts, staggered relief, fewer bodies bunching at the parapet. It looks like discipline from the outside. Inside, it's triage. Briggs gets pulled off the line after nightfall and pushed under cover in a shallow dugout that smells like wet wood and old tobacco. A lantern burns low. The lieutenant sits across from him with a stub pencil and a scrap of paper torn from a larger ledger. No speeches, no hero talk. The officer asks for details the way a clerk asks for dates. Time of first engagement? Distance? Target description? Any return fire? Any observed effect? Briggs answers in numbers and landmarks, not adjectives. The stump, the pine seam, the hat brim, the cloth on the barrel, the decoy slit taking the first shot, the second position that made the real kill possible. The lieutenant writes fast, then pauses. A question hangs there, unasked at first, because it sounds like an accusation even when it isn't. "That tube," he finally says. "Where did you get the lenses?" Briggs tells him the truth. One lens came from a cracked field glass taken off a dead cavalry officer after the Wilderness. Nobody's name on it anymore, just brass and glass. Another was bought from a peddler months ago, the kind that sells knives, buttons, cheap spectacles, and lies. A machinist friend back in Pennsylvania helped him understand focal length before the war turned everything into mud. The mount was all his own doing. Wire, pitch, scrap iron, and stubbornness. The lieutenant stares at him like he's hearing a confession to something both brilliant and illegal. Then the officer does something that matters more than praise. He folds the paper, slides it into his breast pocket, and says, "If anyone asks, this is just a rifleman's lucky day." That's the first protective lie. More follow. Later that night, the regimental adjutant comes down the trench with a lantern and two men behind him. He's not there to congratulate anyone. He's there to standardize what happened, because if a sector held, somebody upstairs wants to know why. The captain meets him at the traverse and blocks his line of sight with his own body. A quiet conversation follows, short sentences, careful tone. The adjutant wants names. The captain gives him a unit designation instead. The adjutant wants equipment notes. The captain mentions sharp shooting activity and changes the subject to ammunition expenditure. The lantern swings. For a second, the brass tube could have flashed. Briggs keeps it under cloth and stays in shadow because paperwork is a second battlefield, and it kills careers instead of bodies. Around midnight, the Confederates do what Confederates often do when they can't break a section cleanly. They probe it. A few men crawl close in the darkness, testing whether the left has gone soft. Bayonets scrape roots. A twig snaps. A low voice hisses something that sounds like a prayer and a curse combined. Union pickets answer with single shots, not volleys. Noise draws artillery. Artillery collapses trenches. No one wants the night to become a disaster because someone panicked. Briggs doesn't use the scope. Moonlight isn't a friend to glass. Instead, he listens like everyone else, feeling for the enemy's confidence by the way their movement sounds. It's a strange skill, but war forces strange skills into men's bones. The probing fades. Dawn comes again. June 19th, 1864. A different war begins. The war after the assault. Less motion, more endurance, more mud, more digging. The line is settled into what Petersburg will become. Two armies stapled to the earth, measuring progress in yards and misery. On the left, the captain gives Briggs a new assignment without ever naming it. He doesn't say, "You're a sniper." He says, "You watch." That difference matters. A designation becomes official. An instruction stays plausible. So Briggs watches. He watches through the scope when light allows. He watches with naked eye when it doesn't. He learns the Confederate habits in that sector the way he learned machine rhythms back home, where heads appear, where hands reach, where nervous men make the same mistake twice. By afternoon, a wagon rolls up behind the line with replacement ammunition and a small canvas sack that feels too light to be important. Inside are two things: a tin of lampblack and a note, unsigned, no rank, just a directive written like it came from someone who didn't want credit. Keep the glass dark. No reflections, no skyline use. A second line follows, even shorter. Good work yesterday. That's all the recognition he gets that week. No medal, no ceremony, no newspaper mention. A corporal with a homemade tube doesn't fit cleanly into an army that runs on issued equipment and predictable doctrine. Still, the consequences spread, because armies copy what works. A week later, a man from another company comes down the trench and asks, too casually, whether Briggs knows anything about mounting a lens without it walking loose. The next day, someone else asks about soot and glare. Another wants to know how he kept the recoil from shifting his alignment. Questions like that are how an idea migrates, not with speeches, with whispers. By July, one more scoped rifle appears in the regiment, crude, unofficial, wrapped in cloth like a secret. By August, a lieutenant in a neighboring unit has a tube so ugly it looks like plumbing. The quartermaster pretends he never saw it. Nobody changes the manual. The manual changes anyway. Briggs never becomes famous in the way songs make men famous. His name doesn't get pinned to a tactic. No general writes a flattering paragraph about him in a memoir. What he gets is smaller, and in the trenches, smaller can still mean everything. Fewer heads rising on the parapet. More men going home with both eyes. A left sector that stays intact long enough for the rest of the line to survive its own bad days. On a quiet evening near the end of June, the captain finds Briggs cleaning the scope under cover, moving slow and careful like the brass might break if he looks at it wrong. The officer watches for a moment, then speaks without ceremony. 6 weeks ago, he says, I would have told you to throw that thing in the river. A pause. Today, I'm telling you to keep it alive. No handshake follows. No grand speech comes. The captain just turns back toward the trench line because the war doesn't care about personal arcs. Night settles again over Petersburg. Briggs wraps the tube in cloth, tucks it into the hollow he's carved beneath his blanket, and lies down in the mud with his rifle within reach. A shaky hand isn't weakness anymore. It's evidence of cost. Tomorrow he'll watch the same trees. Tomorrow the enemy will try to learn him again. And somewhere out there, another gray rifleman will stare at a stump and wonder why men keep falling with no shooter in sight. June 20th, 1864, 6:09 a.m., east of Petersburg. Morning comes thin and gray, the kind that makes distances lie. Along the left sector, fog hangs in strips between the pines and the ragged stumps where yesterday's skirmish line formed. Briggs is already in position, but not in the same place. A fresh loophole has been cut 2 traverses down, angled so his barrel never breaks the skyline and the glass never catches a straight sunbeam. The tube is blackened now, not just on the outside, but inside the mount where the brass used to gleam. None of that makes it safe. Someone out there has had 2 days to decide the glass man needs to disappear. At 6:14, the first shot arrives, not at a head but at the sandbag itself. The ball hits low, puffs dust and fiber, and tells Briggs the enemy isn't guessing anymore. A second shot follows 10 seconds later. Almost identical placement, like someone is walking rounds up an invisible ladder. No panic shows, only procedure. Briggs doesn't answer with a shot. Instead, he pulls back, shifts his weight, and slides to the secondary slit the captain had ordered prepared at midnight. Same lane, different angle, different geometry. The rifle goes up slow. The scope comes onto the line like a door being eased open, not kicked. Out beyond the pine smoke, a Confederate marksman is doing what good marksmen do. He isn't hunting bodies, he's hunting habits. That's why Briggs changes the habit again. From the second slit, he watches the place the counter-sniper has to use if he wants to keep climbing those rounds. A narrow seam between two black trunks, a pocket where a man can hide his shoulder and still see Union parapets. The seam stays empty for a long minute. Then, a sliver of movement appeared. Cloth, not flesh, a careful inch of sleeve. Briggs doesn't fire. A sleeve can be bait. A sleeve can be nothing. The real tell comes a beat later when the sleeve shifts and a small flash of metal flickers, not bright like a mirror, more like a dull coin catching weak sun. That isn't a sleeve. That's a sight. Briggs breathes out, settles the post, and waits for the second movement because the first one is often just a test. When it comes, it's the tiniest rise of a cheek and cap brim, barely above the root line. One shot cracks, no follow-up. The seam goes still. A man doesn't always fall where you can see it, especially when he's tucked into brush, but the firing stops from that pocket as if someone cut a cord. Silence is its own confirmation. Down the trench, someone whispers, "Don't move," like the words might keep death from returning. Another 5 minutes pass. A different rifle opens up from farther right. Wilder, hurried, lower-quality fire, an angry friend trying to punish a position he thinks is responsible. The rounds smack sandbags and chew wood, but they don't land with the same careful intent. That's when Briggs understands the real change. The Confederates didn't just lose a shooter, they lost the certainty that their countershot would work. By mid-morning, the left sector settles back into its ugly routine. Sporadic snaps, distant artillery, the constant scrape of men improving earthworks with bayonets and tin plates, because proper tools are always somewhere else. Behind the line, the lieutenant returns with the same pencil and the same paper, only this time he doesn't ask for a story. He asks for the seam. He asks for the angle. He asks for the method that let Briggs survive the counterhunt. A diagram gets sketched. A warning gets written in the margin. Never fire from the first slit after sunrise. That's how tactics spread in the Army of the Potomac. Not as doctrine, as notes passed hand to hand by men who don't want to die the same way twice. Late afternoon brings the last attempt. A gray skirmish line forms again in the smoke at roughly the same distance as the first day, trying to see if the left has softened now that the drama has faded. The shapes move cautious, then bolder when no immediate punishment arrives. Briggs lets them take 2 steps too many before he fires. One drops, then another. The rest melt backward like they have remembered something painful. No chasing follows. No cheering starts. Holding a line at Petersburg isn't a victory you celebrate. It's a catastrophe you delay. Evening comes, and with it, the count, because the captain insists on numbers. 11 for the day that started it. 2 more in the days after. 1 counter-sniper who never fires again. The left sector still holds. That last detail matters most, so it becomes the one that gets repeated in reports without explaining why. A week later, the siege continues like it always will. Digging, probing, starving the city by inches. New faces arrive, old ones vanish. The trenches keep eating men in ways that don't make headline. Somewhere in that machinery, Briggs remains what he started as, a corporal with an issued rifle, a private invention, a quiet method that the paperwork never fully names. When the war finally releases him, months later, thinner, older, eyes permanently trained to search for seams, he doesn't carry home a flag or a famous weapon. He carries a brass tube wrapped in cloth, a thing the Army never ordered and never officially approved. Back in Pennsylvania, it ends up in a trunk the way dangerous tools often do. Not displayed, not bragged about, stored like a reminder that cleverness can keep you alive, but it never makes the cost disappear. And if you're wondering why men laughed at him in the first place, the answer is simple. Armies trust what they can issue. Survival sometimes comes from what one stubborn soldier dares to build anyway.